All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Beginning by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan. Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this month as a schus for a Shlema for the Kathy's sister, Donna Baker Matson. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, she together with Kol Yisrael have a complete and enduring refuah. But with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Chof Beis 22. And we are picking up in Eretz Hashem on at the Mishnah on Chof Aleph from Beis 21b. So we have a lot of ground to cover today, but some really very, very interesting sugyas. So let's begin with the Mishnah. One cannot write a get with anything that is connected to the ground. Okay? So the Gemara says, if ultimately go, and remember again, we actually saw this in yesterday's daf already. This is based on the concept that when the Torah discusses a get is called a sefer krisos. So because it is called a sefer, because it is called a book, therefore by definition it cannot be mechuber. We also saw the idea that the Torah says, when the Torah describes the process of get, it's v'kasav v'nasan. There has to be an immediacy between the writing and the giving. There can't be any intervening process. If something is written or something attached to the ground, then by definition there is an intervening process of ketzitza, of cutting it, of detaching it. So therefore, in kosim mechuber l'karka, kosim mechuber, if one went ahead and wrote on something that is mechuber, talsho, then he went ahead and detached it, b'chasmo, and then signed it, b'nasnala, and then gave it to the wife, kasher. Ultimately, again, it works. It works. Rabbi Yehuda posel. Rabbi Yehuda says it is posel ad shetei ksivasal. The Chasimasa B'talish. Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, holds that no, halacha l'maisa, in order for a get to be kosher, the writing and the signing must be done on something which is detached from the ground. Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira says, in kosvin lo al haniyar hamachok v'lo ala diftra. Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira says you cannot write on an erased piece of parchment, nor on diftra. So we'll say diftra also is like a we'll see in the Gemara, a semi-processed parchment. The yachal is daif. The denominator over here is because ultimately, again, one could tamper with these documents, and the document, in other words, one can tamper with these types of paper, we'll call it, and the tampering would not be evident. So that's the problem. Now, of course, the Chummas ultimately still say that it's kosher. Good. We'll say, let's analyze. Says the Gemara. Kasar l'chober. So remember again, the Mishnah begins by saying, you can't write a get on something attached to the ground. We'll say, then in the next line of the Mishnah, what does the Mishnah say? If you wrote a get on something attached to the ground, you detached it, you signed it, then it's good. It's a contradiction. To which the Gemara says, "V'hamritreisha in kosvin." You just said before that you can't write a get on something attached to the ground. So what's going on over here? Rabbi Shmuel, v'hu sheshir makam hatoref. So this is very interesting. So Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel. What does it mean? So we're going to talk about this. We have already alluded to this, but again, effectively has two parts. What we'll call a toref and a tofes. The tofes is like the boilerplate. It's like the pro forma part of the shtar. That's the same in every single get. The Toref, ultimately, again, is the part that contains the couple-specific information. Husband's name, woman's name, location, date. That's called the Toref. So we'll say the Gemara, so Rabbi Yehuda's name is Shmuel, that ultimately, again, when the Mishnah says you can't write a get b'mechuber, really what it was referring to is the Toref, which is the ikr of the get, the primary part of the get. That's, again, the couple-specific information. That can't be written on mechuber. But technically speaking, if you wrote the boilerplate part of the get, then you detached the get and wrote the toref on the detached item, that would work. Good. And I will say ultimately again, this would reflect the view of Rabbi Eliezer. What does Rabbi Eliezer say? I will say, you don't really need witnesses to sign on the get. What do you need? You need witnesses ultimately, again, to witness the giving over of the get. And this is what it means to say. I will say, so here's how you would go ahead and read the Mishnah according to Shmuel. Ein kosvin tofes. You cannot write the tofes. Remember, tofes is the boiler part plate of the get, right? You cannot write the tofes on something that is mechuber l'karka. Why? Shema yichtov toref. lest you come to write the couple-specific part of the get on mechuber. Right? Okay. However, kasvul tofes, what if you did it? What if you wrote the boiler part of the get when it was attached? Vitalsho, then you detached it. Kasvul toref, then you wrote the couple-specific part. Vinasnala, and you gave it to her, parentheses, in front of Eidim Mesira, kasher. Kasher. So I'll say, so therefore again, that is the view, that is the understanding of the Mishnah according to Shmuel. That halacha l'maisa, when the Mishnah means, when the Mishnah says you can't write a get on mechuber l'karka, means you can't write the toref of the get on mechuber l'karka. But we say don't write the tofes, lest you come to write the toref. But if you wrote the tofes, detached it, wrote the toref, gave it over to in front of Eidim Mesira, technically it works. Reish Lakish says chasmu shaninu. Reish Lakish says you can't sign the get when it is mechuber. So we'll say, what does this mean? Rabbi Meir. And Reish Lakish will hold the Mishnah is reflective of the view of Rabbi Meir. What is Rabbi Meir? The Amar Edi Chasima Karsi. Rabbi Meir holds that halacha l'maisa. It is the witnesses who sign on the get to create the effectiveness of the get. And I will say, here's how you read the Mishnah. Watch this. Vachi Kamar. Ein kosven toref shemayachtam. And I will say, now here's what's interesting. If you hold Eidei Mesira Karsi, like we just said before, according to Balazar, so the Eidei Mesira Karsi, so the most important thing is that the Toref, the part of the get that has the couple-specific information, is written Lishma and is written on something detached. According to Rabbi Meir's Eidei Chasima Karsi, the real thing that makes the get is the signatures of the witnesses. So watch this. So according to him, here's how you would read the Mishnah. In Kosin Toref, you really shouldn't write the Toref of the get when it is mechuber. Why? Lest you come to sign the get when it is attached. Kasvul Toref, but if you ended up writing the Toref, Talsho, then you detached it, Chasmo, and then you signed it when it was detached, the Nasnala, and then you gave it to her, Kasher. Ultimately, again, it would be kosher. So I will say, so halacha l'maisa, just two different ways of reading the Mishnah, both according to Balazar, who holds Eidei Mesira Karsi, and Rabbi Meir, who holds Eidei Chasima Karsi. Good? Because we'll say, remember again, according to Rabbi Balazar, who holds Eidei Mesira Karsi, the ikar is that the Toref, which is the part of the get which contains the couple-specific information, is written on something that is detached. According to Rabbi Meir, who holds Eidei Chasima Karsi, the witnesses who sign on the get create the effectiveness of the get. The most important thing is that the get is signed when it is detached. So each version reads the Mishnah its way. Incredible. Let's go back there. Kasva achares shel atzitz nakov. What's an interesting case over here? What happens if the husband writes the get, ultimately again on a perforated flower pot? So imagine for a moment you have a perforated flower pot that is made out of earthenware. Husband writes the get on the earthenware flower pot. So we'll say, now, remember, we're going to talk about now something very interesting. When you have a pot, an earthenware pot that has perforations on the bottom, so in certain respects, that pot is considered to be mechuber l'karka, is considered to be attached to the ground. Attached to the ground. Now we'll say, so remember again, this is our sugya now, is that you can't write a get on an item that is attached to the ground. Okay, machlokes, which part of the get can be fine. So now watch this case. So if you wrote a get on a perforated flower pot, so what's the halacha? Kosher. Ultimately, again, it is kosher. The shakile v'yoyev le'nehile. Why? Because what can you do? You could just take the pot and give it to the woman. Just right, the husband can take the pot, give it to the woman. Look at Rashi, last Rashi on the base. The shakile l'kule otzitz ve'in kan l'chuser ketzitza ve'in lachosh shema yishbar acharis v'itin lachaticha fagvile ketzitza to the mafsid of the otzitz. So what says, interestingly enough, so the Gemara says over here that because it could just be lifted up and given over to the woman, therefore it's not considered to be mechuber, and therefore halacha l'maisa could just be given over to her, could serve as a kosher get. Fine. Al other shel atzitz nakov. But say, what happens if you have a perforated flower pot, and then the flower pot you have a tree, and the tree has a leaf, and now what happens? You write the get on the leaf, which is in the tree, in the perforated flower pot. So we'll say, so does that work? Abai Amar Kasha, Abai says it's kosher. Rava Amar Pasal, Rava says it's Pasal. What's going on over here? Abai Amar Kasha, so Abai says Kasha. What's the top of Chav Beis? Very simple. The Shakil Le V'Yoyev Le Nehile. Because Rabbi will say, we assume that when the husband writes the get on the leaf of the tree growing in the perforated flower pot, what is he going to do? He's going to give her the pot in its entirety. Right? Because just to be clear, everyone would agree that if halacha l'maaseh you go ahead and you write the entire get on a leaf, then detach the leaf and give it to the isha, that is going to be pasul. It's going to be pasul. So the interesting part over here is you have, by the way, maybe I shouldn't use the word tree, because tree sounds big, right? You have a plant. You have a plant growing in a perforated flower pot. The plant has a large leaf. Husband writes the get on the large leaf. So the Shaila will say, is the get kasher? He says, yeah, because what is he going to do? He's going to give her the entire otzitz. He's going to give her the entire flower pot. Rava Amarava says, pasul, why? Gezerah shema yikdom. Ultimately, again, out of a concern that what's going to happen over here, he's not going to give her the flower pot. What is he going to do? What is he going to do? He's going to detach the leaf. And also remember again, then this would be a case of writing a get b'mechuber lekarka, and ultimately again it would be invalid. Good. So therefore what we emerge with so far is you cannot write a get on an item, on material that is attached to the ground. Now, depending on who you hold like, Rabbi Elazar or Rabbi Meir, namely, again, is it Eidei Mesira who create the effectiveness of the get, or Eidei Chasima? So that'll shape what can be written on material that is attached and what can't be written on material that is attached. So that's, again, that overarching machlokes is still here. Good. So we'll say, so now that we started talking about this atzitz nakov, this perforated flower pot, let's talk about it a little bit more. Atzitz is in this case, atzitz shel achad, uzraim shel achar. So let's say, listen to this. Let's say you have a perforated flower, you say you have a flower pot, perforated flower pot, right? Ultimately, again, and the pot belongs to one person, and the seeds belong to a different person. So the pot belongs to Ruvain, the seeds belong to Shimon. So what happens? Machar bal atzitz lebal zraim. I'm sorry, by the way, this is not perforated. This is just a regular pot, right? Atzitz means just a flower pot. Atzitz nokov is the perforated one. So we'll say, so now watch this. So now you have the atzitz belongs to Ruvain. Ultimately, again, the zraim, the seeds belong to Shimon. So machar bal atzitz lebal zraim. If the owner of the flower pot wants to sell to the owner of the seeds, kevan shemashach kana. So ultimately, again, once the owner of the seeds does mashicha on the flower pot, he's kona. We'll say, now why? What's the logic? Here's the interesting part over here. Remember, the flower pot is metaltalin. It's movable property. Because remember, again, it's not perforated, so it's not mechaber lekarka. It's movable property. On the other hand, interestingly enough, the zra'im, the seeds, what are the seeds? Karka. Even though it's karka contained in metaltalin, it's still called karka. So therefore, if the owner of the pot wants to sell to the owner of the seeds, no problem. We'll say, how are you kona metaltalin? How are you kona movable property? Mashicha. I mean, that's one of the ways, right? You do mashicha on it, right? You take it, you pull it, and it's yours. Machar bazran lebal atzitz. What happens if the owner of the seeds wants to sell to the owner of the atzitz? Lo kana achiyachsik bizraim. So we'll say, so then remember, again, halacha l'maisa, how do you acquire karka? Chazaka, a proprietary act. Take a look at Rashi. Second line from the top in Rashi, achiyachsik bizraim. Atzitz have talush. Remember, Rashi goes through this. The flower pot is talush. It's considered to be detached, i.e. metaltalin, umikni b'mashicha. Zra'im havu mechubarim v'dinam kikarka. Remember, the seeds, on the other hand, we'll say, interestingly enough, the seeds themselves are considered to be karka. Therefore, v'niknim b'kasef u'shtar u'b'chazaka. Ultimately, again, they're acquired through money, right? How karka is acquired through money, shtar, document, chazaka, proprietary act, v'achi yachsik, kigon denichash o ider dahavye chazaka or below yoav moskar. So we'll say, for example, so therefore, listen to the second case. So therefore, if the owner of the seeds is selling to the owner of the pot, how does the owner of the pot acquire the seeds? So we'll say, so again, let's say he goes in and he does something with the soil in which the seeds are, right? So that would be called a case of chazaka. And because case of chazaka, fine. Atzitz uzraim shel achar umachran la'achar. So listen to this. What happens if the pot and the seeds are owned by one person, and the owner of these product items wants to go ahead and sell them to another person? Right. So Reuven owns both the pot and the seeds, and he wants to sell it to Shimon. So what's talacha? Kana atza hechsik bizraim kana atzitz. So I'll say this is fascinating. once Shimon does, let's say, chazaka, or acquires the seeds, he automatically acquires the pot as well. What's the logic behind that? I will say, V'zoi sheshaninu, nechasim she'in lehen achrayis, niknim im nechasim sheish lehen achrayis, bekesef ubishtar ubechazaka. So I will say, this is a general halacha, which is quite fascinating, is if you're acquiring, let's say I'm purchasing from Ruvain two things. I'm purchasing from him land as well as movable property. The halacha says that the kinyan done on real property has the ability to acquire movable property. As I will say, this happens all of the time in real estate transactions, right? So let's say I'm purchasing a piece of land from Ruvain, and included in that land, let's say I'm buying a farm. Included in that land is farming equipment, right? So the land obviously is karka, right? The farming equipment is metaltalin. So now we'll say the halacha says once I acquire the land, right, karka, I could acquire all the movable property along with it. There's machlokes in general as to whether or not the movable property has to be situated on the land or not. That's a different discussion. But l'maisa, for our purposes, if I'm buying both real and movable property, the kinyan on the real property allows me to simultaneously acquire the movable property as well. Conversely, on the other hand, hechsik ba'atzitz, av atzitz lo kana ach yachsik bizran. I will say, if I did it, on the other hand, let's say again, Reuven is selling both the atzitz and the zraim, ultimately again to Shimon. If Shimon just did a chazaka on the atzitz, so again, remember, chazaka on atzitz doesn't do anything. Because remember again, I will say, what's ta'alacha? Atzitz is metaltalin. In order to acquire metaltalin, what do you need? Mashicha. So a proprietary act on the atzitz not only will not work for the atzitz, but it also doesn't work for the seeds. Incredible. So we'll say, so what does that have to do with our sugya? Absolutely nothing. So why is it here? Because we mentioned atzitz. Right? That's all. That's the connection over here. In general, I will say, it is always fascinating to see this case of the perforated flower pot is such a fascinating and dynamic case that has so many different ramifications. Remember again, it was just brought up over here. The reason we got into it was because the atzitz, right? The atzitz is an interesting case of mechaber the karka. So imagine you're writing a get on a leaf on a plant that is growing inside in atzitz nakav, a perforated flower pot. So that is called mechaber the karka. Once we got into that, we got into this case. Once we got into this case, we also listen to this next case. Nikvo ba'aretz, nakva ba'aretz, v'nofa b'chutz la'aretz. We'll say now another fascinating case. Here we go. Imagine the following situation. You have your perforated flower pot. Shabbos say, in the perforated flower pot, there is a tree that is growing. The tree is producing fruit. So imagine the following situation. You have the perforation, let's say, is in Eretz Yisrael, but the branch with the fruit extends into Chutz La'aretz. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Nikvu ba'aretz v'nofa b'chutz la'aretz. In the short lines, it's about 5 lines. In Nakvo ba'aretz v'nofa b'chutz la'aretz, shaya munach ala gvul. For example, you have the perforated flower pot that is sitting on the border of Eretz Yisrael. V'nof hazra nota chutz la'atzitz chutz l'gvul. So we'll say, so literally, the perforation is sitting opposite the soil of Eretz Yisrael. So essentially, the pot itself is considered to be mechubar to Eretz Yisrael, but the branch with the fruit is growing outside of Eretz Yisrael. So we'll say, so now what's my shaila? My shaila is, what is the halacha ultimately again for trumas and maisrus? Produce grown in Eretz Yisrael is subject to trumas and maisrus. Produce grown outside Eretz Yisrael is not. So what's the halacha? So Abaye says, basar nuk vo azlinan. Abaye says, we go after the perforation. We have the perforation. Since ultimately, again, the perforation is in Eretz Yisrael, therefore the assumption is that this plant gleans its nutrients from Eretz Yisrael, therefore it's an Eretz Yisrael plant. It's an Eretz Yisrael plant. Right? Rava says, basar no fo azlinan. Rava says, no, not true. We look ultimately, again, where is the fruit situated? Where is the fruit situated? Ultimately, again, wherever the fruit is situated, that's where it's from, and therefore, Rava would say, ultimately, again, therefore it's a chutz la'aretz fruit, and therefore not subject to trumas. So I will say, there's a beautiful component as well. If you think about this, sometimes for many of us, there is an ongoing source of existential pain about the inability to be in Eretz Yisrael. Right? a source of existential pain every single day, like a gaping hole in one's heart. So it's interesting to see that you see something fascinating. According to Abaye, so we'll say, let's take work backwards. We normally assume that halacha l'maisa, ultimately, again, where you grow is where you are, right? So according to Rabbi, look, you're in Chutz La'aretz. If you're in Chutz La'aretz, so that's where you're growing. That's where you are, right? That's where your fruit is. That's where Abaye says something very interesting. Abaye says that sometimes, even if physically you're situated somewhere, but if your nourishment comes from somewhere else, you're considered to be situated in the place from where your nourishment is derived. See, even though your fruit could technically be situated in Chutz La'aretz, but if halacha l'maisa, you're unika, if you feel that your ikar neshama is nourished from the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, then ultimately you are rooted in Eretz Yisrael. But physically, the fruit is hanging in Chutz La'aretz. Abai says, I got it. Nakvo, if ultimately the nourishment is gleaned from Eretz Yisrael, just know that endows you with some level of Eretz Yisrael identity. So a little bit of chizuk for those of us again who want more than anything to be in Eretz Yisrael, but our fruit is still here, and maybe the fruit is still going to be here for the foreseeable future. But Lamai says, as long as you feel that some of your nourishment comes from Eretz Yisrael, then ultimately again the fruit is considered to be Eretz Yisrael fruit. To which the Gemara says, Bida Ashrush. So here's what's interesting. So we'll say, so remember, why is this machlokes coming up? So the Gemara says, the reason machlokes seems to be coming up is because we're talking about a perforated flower pot. Now, I will say, the whole chap of the perforated flower pot is what doesn't it have, or what doesn't, it doesn't have roots. So the Gemara says, B'da ashrush kol ya'amalo pligi. The truth is, but remember, if a plant took root in Eretz Yisrael, but the branches happened to grow into Chutz La'aretz, in that situation, everyone agrees that it's considered to be Eretz Yisrael fruit. Ki pligi, b'da lo ashrush. So we'll say, so where's the machlokes? The machlokes is only, again, when roots have not grown, like the case of the perforated flower pot. So you have the perforation, right, the hole is sitting opposite the ground of Eretz Yisrael. But there are no roots. So that's the machlokes. Abaye says, okay, but the perforation is there, the unika, the nourishment, the nutrients are coming from there. It's Eretz Yisrael fruit. Rava says, no. We look at where the fruit is actually situated. It's situated in Chutz La'aretz. The Gemara says, B'da asher shlo plegi, is that true? Is that true? That when the fruit took root, ultimately again, there's no machlokes? Well, I would say, watch this case. This is fascinating. V'hatnan, shtei ganos zu al gav zu. So we'll say, watch this. What if you have two gardens, one on top of the other? So we'll say, what they're referring to over here is terrace planting. Right? So we'll say, so again, you see this all over in Eretz Yisrael. So right, so what do? We'll say it's incredible. So let's say you have a mountain or whatever, a hill, and you want to plant. The problem is you can't plant a field like this. So what do you see all over Israel? Terrace gardening, right? Which is that essentially you go ahead, you find it, essentially you build multiple retaining walls. That's pretty much what you're doing. You carve out multiple retaining walls over the course of the mountain. So you have flat retaining wall, and again, that way you could plant along the slope. Now I will say, here's what's interesting. This is fascinating. So imagine you have two gardens, one on top of the other. So right, literally, terrace planting. Now I will say, what happens? What happens if I have produce that grows essentially out of the retaining wall? So it's growing out of the retaining wall. So what's the shaila? Who does that belong to? Does that belong to upper garden or lower garden? That's the case over here. So the Gemara says, Shtei ganos zu al gabzu. Two gardens, one on top of the other. Vagerek bein simon. Literally, again, the vegetable is between them, meaning the vegetable is growing out of the retaining wall. So who does it belong to? To which the Gemara says, so if you look at Rashi says over here, so Ashtei ganos zu al gabzu. So in the middle of Rashi, it says, Vagerek bein simon, begider hagvoa, so this is fascinating. So when you look at this plant that's growing, it is planted in the soil of the upper field, but it is growing into the airspace of the lower field. So who does it belong to? So what does it belong to? So Rabbi Meir Omer Shal, Rabbi Meir says it belongs to the upper garden, since it's growing in the soil of the upper garden. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Shal Tachton, Rabbi Yehuda says no, it belongs to the lower garden, since it is growing in the airspace of the lower garden. So we'll say, what do you see from here? Why is this case being brought? This case is being brought because we're both saying, you see that even when you have an item that has taken root, there's still a machlokes if the roots are in one space and the we'll call it the branch, so to speak, is in a different space. Where does it belong? So Gemara wanted to suggest the only reason you had the machlokes Abai and Rava before about the flower pot was because there were no roots. But if there are roots in Eretz Yisrael, everybody would agree it's an Eretz Yisrael plant. Or converse would be also true. Tushmar says, no, you see, it's not true. Even when there are roots, there's still a machlokes going on over here. To which the Gemara says, no. Hasan Kidik Tani Taima. About the case of the two gardens, one on top of the other, is actually a totally different situation. Amrei Meir, Mam Yirtze Al Yoni Tolas Afro in Kain Yarek. I will say the reason machlokes over there is because Rabbi Meir will say, if the upper garden wanted to remove its soil, ultimately, again, there's no longer that vegetable growing out of the retaining wall. So therefore, it's clear that it belongs to the upper garden. Ultimately, again, Rabbi Yehuda, Mam Yirtze Tachton Malos as Ginaso Afar in Kain Yarek. So Rabbi Yehuda says, no, if the lower one wanted to fill up his garden with dirt, ultimately, again, the item would not be able to grow out of the retaining wall. So that's the machlokes. Shabbos says, since each party were to manipulate its field, ultimately, again, the growth would no longer be in existence. That's the source of the machlokes. V'akati b'da'ashu shlo pligi, but still, are you trying to tell me that if the item took root, there would not be a machlokes? So let's go back for just a second. The case that we're talking about was the following situation. I have a perforated flower pot where the perforation is situated in Eretz Yisrael, but the branch with the fruit is growing into Chutz La'aretz. So I have a very simple shaila. I pick the fruit from that tree. Is it chayiv in Shumas and Meisus or not? Is it considered to be Eretz Yisrael fruit? Is it considered to be Chutz La'aretz fruit? And this is the machlokes. Abaye says it's Eretz Yisrael fruit. We look at where the perforation is. The perforation is in Eretz Yisrael. This is considered to be fruit nourished from Eretz Yisrael. Rava says, no, it's Chutz La'aretz fruit. We look at where the fruit is actually situated. The Gemara posited that this machlokes is only in a situation where you have a perforation, but what don't you have? What don't you have? Roots growing into the ground. But everyone would agree that if roots were growing into the ground, wherever the roots are, that establishes identity. So the Gemara is challenging that assertion. Vakati, b'da'ashu shlo pligi, is that true? Where there are roots, there's no machlokes. Look at the following case. So we'll say fascinating. Vatanya, we learn. Elon. Miktsasa ba'aretz u'miktsasa b'chutz la'aretz. So we'll say here, I have a pretty dramatic case. I have a tree. We'll say with roots growing into the ground. The tree literally straddles the border of Eretz Yisrael. Half of it is in Eretz Yisrael, half of it is outside of Eretz Yisrael. And I will say, what's the halacha? Tavel v'chulin mu'uravin bazeh divrei Rebbe. So we'll say, how do you look at the fruit? Rebbe says, mamish, because half of it is in Eretz Yisrael, half of it is in Chutz La'aretz. Therefore, what? The fruit is mamish, a mixture. It's a mixture. Look at Rashi, almost right across. Rashi says, "Im lecha pri be'ilan hazeh shein miktsasa min haaretz shu tevel or miktsasa l'chutzar shu chulin lefi she'inika misareves v'nafka mina shein me'asri mitzav." So Rebbe will say literally, every single piece of fruit on that tree is a mixture of Chutz La'aretz and Eretz Yisrael, of what we'll call tevel, meaning untithed produce, Eretz Yisrael produce, and chulin, Chutz La'aretz produce. Rabbi Shmuel Silber says, "Hagadol b'chiv chayiv, hagadol b'pater pater." Rabbi Shmuel says, "No. We look at where it grows. The stuff from the part of the tree that's situated in Eretz Yisrael will be chayiv and shumas and ma'asros. The stuff that grows in the Chutz La'aretz part will not be chayiv and shumas and ma'asros." So we'll say, point over here is, what do you see? This is a case of b'da'ashrush. This is a case of where there are roots, and yet still, what do you see? There's a machlokes about the identity of the produce. Pretty incredible case. So the Gemara says, "My love miktsas nofal ba'aretz u miktsas nofal b'chutz la'aretz." Are we not dealing with the case where part of the branches, ultimately again are so part of the branches are chutz la'aretz? Tushmer says, "Lo miktsas shrashin ba'aretz u miktsas shrashin b'chutz la'aretz." I'll say, no, this is a different kind of case. In this case, quite literally, half of the roots are in Eretz Yisrael, half of the roots are in Chutz La'aretz. To which the Gemara says, if that's the case, My time with Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. So I will say, so then I understand Rabbi's position. Rabbi's position is going to say that since half of the roots are in Eretz Yisrael, half of the roots are in Chutz La'aretz, therefore what? The fruit of this tree is mamish, a mixture of chulin, right? Produce in Chutz La'aretz, and tevel, Eretz Yisrael produce. And there, every single fruit is going to be a mixture. But Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, if half of the roots are in Chutz La'aretz, so why are you going after where the fruit is growing, right? Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, the parts of the branches that hang into Chutz La'aretz, that's Chutz La'aretz fruit. The part of the branches that hang into Eretz Yisrael, that's Eretz Yisrael. But why? But if half of the roots are Chutz La'aretz, half of the roots, that means mamish, who cares where the fruit is growing? The fruit is mamish, a mixture. To which the Gemara says, my time Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, this is fascinating, the mafsik tsunba. I will say it's fascinating, just to complicate this even more. I will say in the root level of the tree, there is a stone. There is a stone. Right? So I will say, so now watch this. The tree is growing on the border of Eretz Yisrael, literally straddling the border, right? And it's on top of a stone that is mamish on the border as well. So when the roots grow, the roots are actually growing separately. There are chutz la'aretz roots on one side of the tree, and on one side of the stone, and Eretz Yisrael roots on the other side of the stone. And therefore, again, so what's going on over here? So my time with the Rebbe. So we'll say, so what's Rebbe's logic? Rebbe says, the Hadri Arvi, right? So Rebbe says, ultimately, again, my time with Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, the Mafsik Tzunba. So Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, listen, because ultimately, again, there is a stone that mamish divides the roots. Therefore, also Rabbi Shimon Gamliel's model, what he almost views it as is, one side of the tree is nourished from Eretz Yisrael roots, one side of the tree is nourished from Chutz La'aretz roots, and therefore the status of the fruit, mamish, depends on where it's growing. Rebbe, on the other hand, holds, my time with the Rebbe, the Hadar Arvi, Rebbe holds, while it's true that there are separate Eretz Yisrael roots and separate Chutz La'aretz roots, but I will say, what happens once the nutrients get into the trunk? What happens? It's a cholent. It's a nutrient cholent, right? And they're mixing together again, and therefore it turns out that the fruit, all the fruit on the tree, is really simultaneously nourished by both roots, by both roots, we'll call it. So the Gemara says, what are they arguing about? Mar Savar Avira Mebalbel. One says, literally again, Avir Mebalbel means like the airspace, the trunk. Once it gets into the trunk, everything becomes mixed together. That's the position ultimately of Rebbe. Umar Savar Hailichudei v'Hailichudei Koi. Rebbe, on the other hand, Rabbi Shimon holds that no, that ultimately again, since the roots are divided, the nutrients remain divided as well as they make their way up the tree. And therefore, ultimately, again, it remains separate and distinct. Rabbi said it happens to be, by the way, the way the Rambam paskins in this case is like Rebbe, that if you have this type of situation of a tree that straddles the border of Eretz Yisrael, and half of it is coming Eretz Yisrael, half of it is Chutz La'aretz, we view ultimately again the fruit as tevel and chulin me'urav and yachid. We look at all of these fruit as again a mixture of Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. Okay, quite again. I will say, how do we get to this? All this because we spoke about writing a get on a leaf in a plant in an atzitz nakov. Good, but fascinating nevertheless. The Gemara goes weiter. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseir Omer. So also Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseir said that you cannot write a get on niyar hamachuk, on erased parchment, or on diftera. So let's analyze. So Amar Rabbi Chia bar Asi Mishmein Deula. Gimel Orosein. There are really three different types of hides, or three different types of skins, upon which you could write. What are the three? What are they called? Matzah, chifa, and diftera. Good. So let's go through them. Matzah. What's matzah? Kimashma'o. We'll say matzah is just like it sounds like. It has absolutely no ingredients or no additives. For example, in general, we're going to see that in order to create fully usable parchment, there are three steps. Number one, you salt it. Number two, you treat it with flour. And then number three, you treat it with walnut juice. Matzah, delo maliach, udelo kamiach, udelo afitz. So matzah has none of these processes done to it. So it's just a piece of skin, right? It's not rawhide. It's obviously processed a bit, but l'maisa not treated with any of these items. So l'may hilchasa. So we'll say, so in other words, what's the ramifications over here? Lo tzas v'Shabbos. So we'll say it's important because again, on Shabbos, we'll say in general, one is only chayv malacha if we do something constructive. with something meaningful. So, for example, I will say matzah. If you carry matzah, the type of matzah parchment, if you carry matzah on Shabbos, you're going to be chayiv. But how much matzah do you need to carry in order to have liability? Enough to go out. I will say sometimes what they would do with matzah hide or matzah skin or matzah parchment is they would use it to cover weights. So remember again, if you're using weights, you don't want the weights to erode over time. So how do you do that? They would cover it with a thin covering. They would use matzah to cover weights. How much is that? The kama amrabai ki riva de pumpadisa. 1/4 of the 1/4 measure of pumpadisa. So we'll say if you carry this measure of matzah on Shabbos, ultimately you would be chayiv. Next, chifa. So we'll say what's chifa? Timaliach velo kamiach velo afitz. So we'll say chifa. So the skin, the hide is salted, but it is not treated with flour, nor is it treated with walnut juice. Lemay hilchasa. So we'll say, what's the ramification of this? Shalot tzas b'Shabbos, to teach you how much you're chayv for carrying on Shabbos. V'kama shira, we'll say, how much chifa do you have to carry? In other words, what's the minimum amount of chifa for which there is liability for transport on Shabbos? So the Gemara says, Kidisnan or Kedei Lasos Kamiya. So we'll say, enough to make an amulet. Enough to make an amulet. Good. Diftera. What's diftera? Timaliach v'kamiach v'lo office. Diftera, both say, is treated with salt, treated with flour, but not walnut juice. Lamay hokusa, lotza Shabbos. So we'll say, ultimately, again, the ramification of this is because there's liability for transporting it on Shabbos. How much do you have to transport on Shabbos for you to be liable? V'kama shiuro kadei lichtov alav es haget. So it says, here it is, right? Remember again, Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseir is the one who said that you could go ahead and Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseir said you can't use diphthera. The Chachamim said you can use diphthera. Therefore, how much diphthera are you liable for carrying on Shabbos? The amount of diphthera necessary to write a get. Good. So we'll say, by the way, this is also just good Talmudic education. Right, so now I know the three different types or three different stages of parchment, right? Which is matzah, chifa, diphthera. We'll say, of course, what comes after diphthera? Comes after diphthera? Klaf, right? Klaf is finished parchment, right? And now you see what makes finished parchment. Again, right? Salted, right? Maliach, kamiach, ultimate kamiach, salted flour, and afitz, walnut juice. After that, you have klaf. Incredible. The Chum say you can use diphthera. Man Chacham, who the Chum, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Beis will say, Rabbi Elazar says, so Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi say, I just want to point out that, right? So who are the Chachamim? Rabbi Elazar says it's Rav Elazar. So we'll say, remember again, Rabbi Elazar is an Amora, right? An Amora. So Rabbi Elazar, the Amora, is saying, who is the Tana of our Mishnah? Rav Elazar, the Tana. Rabbi Elazar the Tana. Okay, good. So the Gemara says, the Amar Eidei Mesira Karsi. Ultimately, again, because Rabbi Elazar holds, it was what we just saw before, Eidei Mesira Karsi. Rabbi Elazar holds that the witnesses who witness the giving over of the get, they are the ones ultimately who go ahead and create the effectiveness of the get. So let's take a look at Rashi for just a moment. First Rashi and Chav Beis, my Beis 22b. Rashi is Rabbi Elazar. The Amar Chasima Saget Eno Min HaTorah. So also remember again, we're going to see, again, like I said, we keep making reference to this, but interestingly enough, we haven't really delved into this machlokas. So Rabbi Elazar is of the opinion that what creates effectiveness of the get is giving it over in front of witnesses. So because of that, Rabbi Elazar holds the signing of the get is not necessary midaraisa. Not necessary midaraisa. Right? Rashi says, below sagi, lemisvei below edei misira, de'inhu da'avdi krisus. Dal karchach ba'inan edin diafinan erva davar mimamon bilchach lo chayshina dilma mezaifa. So we'll say now, here's what's going on over here. What's the issue with using diphthera? So if you look at the Mishnah, so Rabbi Yehuda said you can't use niyar machok, you can't use erased parchment, and you can't use diphthera. Now both say, I understand why you can't use erased parchment. Why not? Because they both said, if you use erased parchment, what can you do? You can erase it again and rewrite it, and no one's going to be able to tell the difference because it's already erased to begin with. Diphthera seems to be the same thing. There seems to be a concern about tampering with it. Rabbi Elazar, so the Chum say you could use it. Why? So I'll say, here's what's interesting. If you require Eidei Mesira, we're not really concerned with tampering with the shtar. Why? Because since the document has to be given over in front of witnesses, and witnesses have to understand what is written, right? And any information contained within the get, you can't pull shtick, right? You really can't tamper with it. Why? Because at the end of the day, the witnesses are going to attest to the authenticity, not just that the get was written correctly, but like if you try to slide in any conditions or anything else, the witnesses are there. The witnesses are there. They know exactly what's going on. Go back to Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, "Lo chayshin." It's the last of the white lines in Rashi. Lo chayshin dil mezaifa. We're not concerned that someone's going to try to tamper with the get. Why not? Da amran srichi lemikri, because the Eidei Mesira have to read the get. So I will say, it's not just the pshat that they're standing there watching Reuven give the get to Rachel, but rather what do the Eidei Mesira do before the get is given over? They read it through. They read it through. The Hava Bay to know inu yadi. And if there's a condition, they're going to know. Or if somebody's trying to insert the condition, they're going to know. So therefore, I will say, therefore the Gemara says like this. The Chachamim say you could use these types of documents or these type of parchment, even if potentially could be tampered with. Why? Because since who are the Chachamim? Rabbi Lazar the Tana, who holds Eidei Mesira Karsi, and since the get has to be given over in front of the witnesses, and those witnesses are going to go ahead and read the get, so we know you can't really tamper with it. Can't tamper with it. So the Gemara says, V'amar Rabbi Lazar, lo hechsher V'amar Rabbi Elazar, lo hechsher Rabbi Lazar ela la'altar. But I will say, when is this so? This is actually very interesting. This is only so if ultimately, again, the get is being given over on the very day it was written. Rashi says, El altar shevi asol lebeis biyom shenimsar la lo dia shigrusha v'yatiru alinase techivan da'id nahava ube'edi mesira lo chashinu lezyufa. So we'll say, when does this work? When does this work? Ultimately, again, that you could even use the type of parchment that maybe could be tampered with, but we're not worried about tampering because of Eidei Mesira, only when everything is happening with immediacy. Right? Why? Because we'll say why. Because remember, what this requires is for the Eidei Mesira to have a good working knowledge about the document and about the circumstances of divorce. The concern is that if there's some amount of lag time between the writing of the document ultimately and then the process in the Beis Din, the Eidei Mesira may not be cognizant of some of the details surrounding the get. So that's why it says, Lo hichsher b'lazar el la'altar, aval mikan ad asar yamim lo. I will say ultimately, so again, look at Rashi. All of this is only assuming that she is bringing the get on the day that it was given to her to Beis Din. I will say, there's a lot of things swirling around over here because the Gemara over here is. Remember, one of the things that we established is that a get is being given in front of a group. Right? Now the truth is, that's really only really true when it comes from Medina Sayam. Because what does Medina Sayam require? Right? It will say, technically speaking, if you're bringing a get, right, in Eretz Yisrael, really a husband could give it right over to a wife. So I'll say, so now, imagine the following situation. Let's say you have that type of situation where husband is giving it over to the wife. So we'll say, what does a woman do after she receives her get? Right? What does a woman do after she receives her get? Right? So we'll say, no, it's not drinks on me, right? That's not what she does, right? But rather, again, we'll say, ultimately, again, what she does, she's going to take it to Beis Din. Right? Assuming it was not given in Beis Din, she's going to take it to Beis Din. Why? Because she wants that on record. And if there are anything, we'll say, also remember, she has a ksuva that's owed to her. There's like a lot of other things that go on over here. So we'll say, now watch this. So the Gemara says, so now we're willing to take a little bit of a risk and allow the husband to write the get on something that technically can be tampered with. But we're not worried because they're going to be Eidim who see the actual execution of the get and giving over the Eidei Mesira. So now we'll say the Gemara is qualifying this and says, but by the way, this only works if she's bringing that get to Beis Din immediately on the day that she's receiving it. Because then the details are fresh in the Eidei Mesira's mind, and they could go ahead and keep it on record. And again, the Eidei Mesira know exactly what did or what didn't happen. And if there was some attempt to tamper with it, Halach Ma'aseh Eidei Mesira will know that. But if she doesn't come day of, then ultimately, again, we cannot rely on the fact that perhaps this get was not tampered with. So we'll say fascinating. So Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Yochanan says, no. Even if she comes within 10 days of receiving the get, that's fine. That's fine. Because if there was some condition in the get, mid-kart dakiri, the witnesses will still remember. So we'll say, so here's what's fascinating. So we'll say, you see this tension, right? What's the tension? The tension on one hand is, we'll say, you begin to see, the theme is, we want the get to get done. We want it to get done. And as such, it's in our best interest to place as few limitations on the get as possible. So therefore, the Chum are going to say, write it on diftera. Right? Write it on diftera. It's fine. But you could tamper with diftera. But again, Eidei Mesira. There are going to be witnesses who see the giving over of the get. They're going to know the details of it, and therefore it's fine. They're both say, so now, okay, but, that's only going to work if she brings it to Beis Din the day of receiving it, because then it's fresh in the Eidim's mind. That's Rabbi Lazar. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, even if she brings it within 10 days after receiving it, we'll say, we assume that the Eidim will still be fresh, right? The details will still be fresh in their mind, even within a couple of days after receiving it as well. Okay, Bamar Rabbi Lazar. So also from Rabbi Lazar says, Lo hechsher Rabbi Elazar, Lo hechsher Rabbi Lazar, Ella begittin. Furthermore, I'm going to listen to this. Rabbi Lazar only allowed the use of diftera. Rabbi Lazar, remember again, the Gemara is suggesting the Chachamim in the Mishnah who allowed the use of diftera is in fact Rabbi Lazar who holds Eidei Mesira Karsi. Even Rabbi Lazar said you use diftera is only a din by Gittin. Only by Gittin. Aval b'shar shtaras lo. But Rabbi Lazar said you cannot use diftera for other shtaras. For other shtaras. And Rabbi Lazar said, what's the logic over here? Dechsiv unesatem b'kli cheres leman ya'amdu yomim rabin. So Rabbi Lazar said, here's what's interesting. By a get, we don't need a get. We don't need a get to last. In other words, we'll say we don't need a document that ultimately can last for a very long time. Because what do all you need by a get? What do you need by a get? Ultimately, she needs to get it, she needs to receive it, and then what? Take it to Beis Din, let Beis Din note it, record it, and we're done. We're done. She doesn't have to hold on to that document. We don't need it to last. I will say, that's different than other types of documents, where by definition, the Navi says, often need to last for a longer amount of time. Why I will say? Because you could have a loan document, for example, that, let's say the loan is due in 30 years. Right, or 20 years, or some amount of time. So we'll say, by other documents which do need to last, we don't use diftera. So we'll say, so apparently, the other problem with diftera is not only can you technically tamper with the document, but what else? Apparently, it doesn't last as long. We'll say, take a quick look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Ella begin de inon asuin ella latira. Since the get is made ultimately to permit the woman, v'chola v'yola bezin la'alter v'yatiruha. She brings it to Beis Din. Beis Din sees it, certifies it. V'shuven etzrich leget. She doesn't need the document anymore. She doesn't need it anymore. T'chevan shudra Beis Din yesh zikar v'kol davar. So we'll say this is pretty incredible. Once Beis Din essentially certifies that her get is valid, again, then Beis Din knows that she's divorced. The call goes out that she's divorced. There's nothing more to talk about. So we'll say this is fascinating. So we'll say, so now we see another problem with diftera. And we'll say, by the way, it may be interesting. It could very well be also that based on this, that it could be that the coating with gallnut juice, which is the final step in parchment preparation, not only prevents you from tampering with the document, but also what? Preserves it. Fascinating. So we'll say, so therefore again, when we allow the use of diphthera, this is fascinating, when we allow the use of diphthera, so from the tampering perspective, what we're okay with is, as long as there are Eidei Mesira, you're not going to tamper with it. Right? From the preservation perspective, we don't need it anyway, because halacha l'maisa, once she goes to Beis Din sees it, certifies it, we're done. We don't need the document to last. But for other transactional purposes, often you need a document that is going to last for a long time, so therefore you can't use diphthera. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan says, no, afilu shtaras. No, you can even use diphthera for other shtaras. V'haksiv l'man ya'amdu yomim rabim. But the pasuk says, go ahead and preserve, write your documents so that they can be preserved for a very long time. So both says the pasuk is saying you have to have documents that last, which Rabbi Yochanan says, no. It's not a halacha. We'll say, what is it? Hasam, it's a tovah. We'll say it's not a halacha. First of all, we'll say it's not a pasuk in the Torah, it's a pasuk in the Navi, pasuk in Yirmiyahu. We'll say, by the way, just say, what is Yirmiyahu talking about? Yirmiyahu is talking about to the Jews who are about to go into exile. And he's telling them, preserve the deeds to your land in Eretz Yisrael. Because one day we're going to come back. And when we come back, the nations who are inhabited, they're going to tell you, it doesn't belong to you. Oh, incredible. Right? Yirmiyahu knew what he was talking about, right? They're going to tell you, it doesn't belong to you. hold on to your documentation. This way, again, when you come back, you will be able to show them this land is ours. Always has been ours, always will be ours. So therefore, I will say, Rabbi Yochanan says, Yirmiyah is not giving a halacha. Yirmiyah is not giving a halacha, but rather ultimately, again, Yirmiyah is simply giving an Eitzah Tova, a good piece of advice, ultimately for preserving one's documentation. We'll say, Shkoyach, tomorrow, Miras Hashem, begin with the new Mishnah. All right, Chavran Zoom, have a great day, everyone.